everyone, my name is Lauren and I'm a scientist artist, and today I hope to teach you a really cool science art experiment that you can do at home. I'm going to teach you how to dye fabric with ice dye. Let's get started. Here are some examples of what ice dyeing looks like on fabric, so you can tell there's a little bit of fluidity to the color on the fabric itself. This comes from the dye dispersing as the ice melts. So what do we need to get started? First, you're going to need the right type of dye. I like to use this RIT brand solid dye that works on a bunch of different types of fabrics. Speaking of which, you're going to need a piece of fabric. My favorite type of fabric to use for ice dyeing is 100% cotton. We'll talk a little bit more about which fabrics work best for ice dyeing later when we go to the lab. You can also use 100% cotton t-shirts. You may also want a pair of gloves to keep the dye off of your hands, and then a graded container. I just cut slats in this Tupperware container and use the bottom to collect the water as the ice melts. I essentially just place my fabric on top of this container and let it go. So we need some ice. I like to use a bunch of different sizes and shapes of ice. If you're able, it's a really exciting way to experiment with how the dye might disperse differently on the fabric using different shapes of ice. So let's talk a little bit about this RIT brand fabric dye. First, I'm going to put my gloves on. So now that we have our gloves on, let's take a closer look. Essentially, I'm using a solid base dye, and what that means is that instead of a liquid dye, this dye is actually composed of a bunch of little granules. So you can see here how the dye is a bunch of little granules of a pink color. Now let's talk about the type of fabric to use, and to do that, I'm going to take you to the lab. Cool, so let's talk a little bit about why it matters what type of fabric you use during ice dyeing. It turns out that some human-made materials, like acrylic or polyester, don't actually bind to dyes very well. However, we can use different types of fabrics that are made of either protein-based fibers or cellulose-based fibers. So protein-based fibers are animal-made fibers, so things like wool from a sheep or silk from a silkworm, whereas cellulose-based fibers are plant-based, so things like cotton from a cotton plant or linen. So it's really important to make sure your fabric content is more than 80% of either protein-based fibers or cellulose-based fibers. You also can use 100% cotton, which is my favorite type of fabric to ice dye. So let's get to it. First, we're going to make sure our fabric is nice and damp. I just got my fabric wet with room temperature water, and I'm squeezing excess moisture just into the Tupperware container is fine. Next, we're going to fold and squish the fabric to create fun and unique shapes, but we want to make sure that we're also not having any fabric touching the bottom of the reservoir where the water will be. And now it's time to use the ice. So you can see here that I used 2 full trays of ice to completely cover my fabric. I continued stacking ice on top of itself even when the fabric was completely covered, so go ahead and use as much ice as you can. You also can use different shapes of ice, like I said in the beginning of the video. Now we're going to do the dye. So usually how I do this is I measure out probably about a teaspoon amount of dye onto a little spoon that is specifically for dyeing, and I'll tap that spoon to spread the dye all over the ice. You can use as little or as much dye as you want. Remember to write down what you use so you can compare your notes later if you decide to ice dye again. Essentially, I want to make sure that there are some parts of the ice that are covered maybe more than others to create unique and fun patterns. Now we wait 24 hours as the ice melts and the dye begins to disperse in the fabric. Essentially, it's going to be really hard to wait to see what the patterns look like, but I promise it's going to be worth it. After 24 hours has passed, we're going to rinse off our fabric with lukewarm water and essentially make sure that any excess dye gets washed away. I like to use gloves. Now we're going to heat the fabric in the microwave for 1 minute, and now we let it out to dry. You can either air dry it like I am here, or you also can throw them in a delicates bag and put them in the drying machine, and that's what I've done here. Either way is going to give you beautiful ice dye fabric. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Can't wait to see what you create.